My name's Lynn Wenzel, and I am on the program committee at the North Andover Historical Society, and also the bookstore manager. So we do have some of Dr. Gilkes' books for sale after the presentation. But I just wanted to let you know of some of the fabulous things that we have coming up at the Historical Society for Women's History Month, which is in March. And we're very excited because this coming Tuesday, Representative Trom Wynn, who's one of the local representatives to the State House, she will be here talking about women and immigration issues from a personal perspective. She was the first Vietnamese American elected to the State House. And if you've met Trom, she's a force of nature. So that presentation is at 6:30 this coming Tuesday. It's free to North Andover Historical Society members, and it is $10 otherwise. On Friday, this coming Friday, February 21st at 6 p.m., there is a documentary called Show Her the Money, and it's aimed at demystifying what venture capital is for enterprising women today. Do you know that only about 2% of VC funding goes towards women? So it's going to illuminate this gap between what men and women get for startups. And if you're here at 6 o'clock, there's a little reception with appetizers. So show up at 6 and have a chance to mix and mingle. And then finally for the month, on Tuesday the 25th at 6:30, Speaker Christina Harris talks about the women who were instrumental in changing the world, yet whose names have been left out of the history books. All of these, there's a QR code in the lobby. You can register by using the QR code or through the North Andover Historical Society website. And also take a look at our poster in the lobby about what we're doing for Rev 250. So this is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution that starts this April. And so towns around Massachusetts, including North Andover, are highlighting what we were doing during the Revolution. There's a bus tour that you can sign up for, and a lot of programs around town on April 19th. So take a look at what we've got going on. So I'd like to introduce Gail Forsyth-Vale.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out to this conversation, which is entitled Crusades for Justice, Black Women's Vision and Connection. I'm Gail Forsyth-Vale, and I'm a member of the North Andover African American History Committee and also a member of the Racial Justice Team at the North Parish Unitarian Universalist Church. The North Andover African American History Committee is in its 4th year of a collaboration between community members, the North Parish Church, the town of North Andover, and the North Andover Historical Society. And this year we've expanded beyond the traditional African American History Month. We held 2 events in February. This is our 2nd in March. And we will also participate in the 2025 Andover Juneteenth celebration, which is a collaboration between the town of Andover and the Andover Baptist Church. The event is scheduled for June 19th, and more information is coming about that. Today's program has been funded by a grant from Mass Humanities. The Expanding Massachusetts Stories grant offers financial assistance for projects that collect, interpret, and/or share narratives about the Commonwealth with an emphasis on the voices and experiences that have gone unrecognized or have been excluded from public conversation. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you need any assistance at all during the event, find one of us wearing a name tag with a red lanyard. There is an exit in this front corner to my left and at the back of the theater where you entered. And as you pass the restrooms on the left side of the hallway, just right out there. Podium here. We are blessed to have the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Townsend Gilkes with us tonight, back for the 3rd year in a row. And we have been looking forward to this afternoon. Yes. We have been looking forward to this afternoon since Dr. Gilkes said yes to our invitation to come back and talk about Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin and the intersection of advocacy for women's civil rights and advocacy for civil rights for African Americans in post-Civil War times. Dr. Gilkes is the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Professor Emerita of African American Studies and Sociology at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. An ordained Baptist minister, she is an assistant pastor for special projects at the Union Baptist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She has served as visiting faculty at several seminaries and schools of divinity, most recently Chicago Theological Seminary. She also serves as a distinguished professor, community liaison, and research consultant for the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, which is formerly Hartford Seminary. Dr. Gilkes holds degrees in sociology from Northeastern University, a BA, an MA, and a PhD, has pursued graduate theological studies at Boston University's School of Theology, and has received an honorary Doctor of Divinity from Ursinus College. In addition to her book, If It Wasn't for the Women, Black Women's Experience and Womanist Culture in Church and Community, she has published articles in scholarly journals and edited volumes on race and ethnicity, the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, and African American religion. She has also published sermons in several journals and edited lots of volumes. Until the pandemic, she was Dr. Cheryl on Colby College's radio station, where she hosted a gospel music radio show, The Uncloudy Day, for 19 years. Since the pandemic, she has contributed several opinion pieces to Religion News Service and has written the introduction to the 50th anniversary publication of James Cone's book, The Spirituals and the Blues, An Interpretation. Also with us today, and for which we are grateful, is the Reverend Sheila, is Sheila Cook-Kaiser, who is in the role of interviewer this afternoon. Originally from Memphis, Tennessee, Sheila earned her BA in anthropology at Memphis University and her MA in museum studies at Texas Tech University. She then pursued a National Park Service career to become a historic interpreter and educator. Sheila, along with her husband, moved to Massachusetts in 1980 to work for the National Park Service. During her 35-year career with the National Park Service, she interpreted history, developing talks, tours, and education programs at Saugus Iron Works and Salem Maritime National Historic Sites, and at the Boston National Historical Park. Since her retirement, Sheila continues her love of researching history to discover untold stories, especially women's stories. She often presents talks and tours, as well as develops education programs based on her research. In fact, Sheila's research into Delia Simons led her to uncover parts of the story of the Colored Female Religious and Moral Society of Salem, established in the early 1800s. Sheila presented this research at the Danvers Historical Society last month, and I was there. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And so at this point, with great gratitude, I'm going to turn this over to Sheila and to Dr. Gilkes.
Great, thank you very much. As I was learning about your talk for today and your research that you're doing, I just wondered, as a historian myself, when I'm doing research, it's always interesting if I find something that takes me in a different direction or sparks my interest. So I was wondering what sparked your interest to learn about these women and these women's organization after the Civil War.
Okay. First of all, I'm a sociologist, and we sociologists try to figure out how societies work. And as I was training to become a sociologist, I was in a department that the chair of the department wanted to make sure we had enough teaching experience. So in 1973, I got sent off to teach at the Burlington campus of Northeastern University, which was an interesting experience. I mean, in 72, the chair came to me, stood over me, and this was in the days when department chairs were fairly terrifying. Do you have a driver's license? No, I don't. Go get one. Yes, I went and got one, came back, waved the driver's license in his office door. He said, good, you're going to be teaching in Burlington, Massachusetts next year, and we wanted to make sure you could get there. I said, oh, interesting. Okay, so I was assigned 2 courses. One was Introduction to Sociology, which is always a good one to teach when you're in graduate school because it moves you through all the different subdisciplines of the field while you're preparing for your exams. And then he said, you're going to be teaching race relations. I said, okay. And that was sort of a standard course in most sociology departments because it fit under the rubric of social problems. And, you know, we're going to study race relations and figure out how to get rid of the race problem, right? Well, what made Northeastern University very interesting, and it's sort of one of these things that Andrew Young talks about in terms of godly coincidences. You know, this is God's way of remaining anonymous when things happen like this. Because Northeastern University was busy exploiting older students, non-traditional students who were returning to school or doing their night school, so they were charging them for these courses, and they would take a course, and the course would be 39 weeks long, because they were in the quarter system. So I had to teach this course for 39 weeks, it turned out to be wonderful. It was great training. And the first day, in fact, I mentioned this in the introduction, not the first day, but in my race relations course, because I'm sent out to the Burlington campus. I'm the only one who looks like me in the building, okay? So which was interesting. And one woman raised her hand in class one day. And my women students were interesting because many of them were women who had come through very elite women's colleges and met their husbands and dropped out and raised their families. And now here it is, the 1970s, where women are organizing. They're having women's liberation, and they're returning to school. So I had these college dropouts from elite colleges, so they didn't have any problems with writing skills. They wrote like graduate students, but they're sitting there taking this 100 and something level course. Those were the women in the class. The men in the class, however, were men who were police officers and prison guards who were taking college courses because the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration was giving grants to various city police departments because the riots of the 1960s had brought out a certain problem with policing in America. And so they thought and so they were paying a premium to departments to hire police officers who had college degrees. That sounds all well and good, but one does not learn how to be a police officer in a classroom in college. And if you've ever watched that series, The Rookie, okay, I hear some chuckles. You learn how to be a police officer by actually going out and policing. The same way surgeons learn how to do surgery by getting in the operating room and acquiring skills. The trouble was, you have what the sociologist Everett Hughes, one of my major influences, more about that later, called in a classic article, Dilemmas and Contradictions in Status, because the training officers are older and more skilled with these little boys with these degrees who don't know, you keep your coffee out of your gun hand, kind of thing. And these little boys are being paid more than these senior officers because they have these degrees. So the LEAA said, okay, we will pay for these men to go to school and take courses so they can get better pay and will lessen the gap, the status gap between these two. The trouble was, these men did not prepare to go to college. And so they were terrified, and they would sit in the back of the room, and occasionally they would negotiate with an instructor and say, if we be quiet, will you give us a C? Okay? And I remember I'm the only one who looks like me. So people would take one look at me, because at that time I also was striving to look like Angela Davis's short, fat, evil twin. And so they would look, and many of the men would go, oh God, she's going to hate us. And if there was an alternative section, they would transfer into it. So I had the first couple of years with a bunch of left liberal police officers and these women. Well, one day, one of the women raised her hand and said, why aren't black women in the women's liberation movement? And I'm like, wait a minute. What do you mean? You know, and remember, this is my first year teaching. I'm doing skills acquisition, just like the baby police officers. And I'm like, so you keep talking until you form an answer in your head. And I finally said to them, and these were data I knew because of courses that I had been taking and some of the things. And so I said to these women, I said, until 1965. Now, 1965, you know, is an important year. There's a reason this administration has gone back to cancel out executive orders in 1965, okay? All right. In 1965, there was a report that came out that said that black people were deficient because of their family structures, and it's because the women are too forward, et cetera, and they work and they have careers. And so I said, I basically said to the class, I said, until 1965, because the majority of African American women have been in the labor force. They've been in the labor force since we got here. Hello? We went from 100% labor force participation to some women struggling to be homemakers. You know, that was as if women at home working don't have work. Okay, that's another whole set of stories. But women, they've been in the labor force. And one of the strengths of black families that Robert Hill had talked about was the double earner family. That was a fact of life. The double earner family for especially working class families, but also the double earner family for elite families. Black women coming out of slavery wanted educations, and they were not looking to stay home. So you have the double earner family was a feature all the way through before anybody came up with the term double earner family, or if we're talking about elite families, dual career families. So I said to the class, I said, until 1965, the vast majority of African American women in the labor force were in the labor force as household domestics. And I said, who are their bosses? And so the women in front said very disingenuously, white people. The working class men in back, whose wives are also in the labor force and do not have any kind of help at home except their older teenage kids, right? All of a sudden, we hear this chorus of men in the back go, white women. And I'm like, another country heard from. And I said, I didn't say it out loud, but I said, how do you form a liberation movement with your boss? And it was like people sort of sat back and, in the meantime, remember I said Everett Hughes. Everett Hughes, one of the most wonderful sociologists who ever lived, and whose wife was also a sociologist. But at a time when, if you were a woman with a PhD and your husband had a PhD, you could not work at the same institution. They were called nepotism rules. This was a time which, until 1964, it was perfectly legal to advertise jobs, help wanted male, help wanted female. Some people in this room are old enough to remember those newspapers, because I'm old enough to remember those newspapers. Okay. So and depending on what state you were in. Okay. Remember that thing about states' rights? You've been hearing echoes of that, haven't you? Now you know where it came from. Depending on what state you were in, you could also advertise and put something in the paper that said no colored need apply. Okay? So 1964, we get the Civil Rights Act. 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act. And that the big change that happened with the Civil Rights Act, which a lot of people don't realize when they're talking about something like, for instance, affirmative action, one of the big changes was companies had to start advertising jobs because the bulk of jobs were gotten by word of mouth. Who knew somebody? And that change is something you never hear publicly acknowledged, but it helped everybody in the labor force. Men who didn't have connections had a chance to apply for jobs. One of my students, and I taught at the University College at Northeastern from 73 until 78, okay, so, and then I got my first tenure track job and went on from there. But one of my students was working out in Lynn at one of the plants out there. When he heard what I said about word of mouth, et cetera, he decided to try a little experiment because he was working in the personnel office. And he told me about it later. He said he knew there was going to be a job posting on Monday, but on Friday he went and found one of the black janitors and told him about the job posting that was going to happen on Monday. And he said when he got to work on Monday morning, there was a line of black men around the building waiting to get in to apply for the job. So just desegregating the occupational force was a big deal in 1964, and it was one of the changes that happened for black women in the labor force because they could go and get other jobs, okay? And this is going to get to some of the questions that you asked about class, because you have to, when you're talking about class in the black community, you have to separate jobs from something that sociologists call status. In other words, your prestige level in the community may not be matched by your job, which when I was attending an event at the League of Women for Community Service in Boston, here I was, a graduate student trying to be Angela Davis, short, fat, evil twin, living in jeans and T-shirts. I had to go out and get a dress for a black tie event. So I had jeans, T-shirts, and a dress for a black tie event in the closet. And they knew I was a sociologist when we were having this talk, and we're at this elegant event. And one of the big complaints by these older people who were there, they said, what is wrong with these young people today? The first thing they ask you is, what do you do for work? You don't ask people that, because people knew about the diversity of jobs represented, even though the status might be shared. So this is, I was learning about all of this stuff and dealing with this and trying, we're fighting with, Toni Cade Bambara comes out with this wonderful book called The Black Woman, which is talking about all of this blowback that we as African American women are doing because of this thing called the Moynihan Report. And so if you ever heard of the Moynihan Report, which was written not so much to talk about black women, it was never supposed to be published. It was designed to make conservative Southern Congress people vote for Johnson's Great Society program. That was the whole purpose. And so it was and it was stamped, for internal use only, confidential, etc. The trouble was that the authors of the report also wrote Johnson's graduation speech at Howard University. So he goes to Howard University and gives this speech where he tells people, it's hard to get to the finish line, and we have to do something about your broken families and your poor, and you're talking to, this is Howard University, where the children who are there are the children of those dual professional families that have less than 2 children per average, who were doctors, lawyers, social workers, dentists, married to each other. And they're like, what broken families? What? And so is the press going, what are you, where are you getting this data? So they had to release the report. That's how the Moynihan Report got out. Okay.
Wow.
But it attacks black women.
Yes.
Go back almost 100 years, and, well, not almost 100 years, back to the 1890s, where you have this attack on black women by this reporter who also, and women respond to it. And one of the principal voices in responding to this attack is Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who calls this national conference in Boston for women to come and in defense of ourselves. So this constant struggle to defend. So people are raising all these questions about women. Getting back now, let me tie together the threads of Everett Hughes. Everett Hughes' wife, Helen Hughes, was also teaching at Northeastern. And she taught a course called Men and Women in Social Change. And so I'm taking the course, and we're doing and at the time we weren't talking about gender. Gender is a new invention and conceptualization. We were talking about sex roles, okay, and family when we talked about women in sociology. So she's Men and Women in Social Change. So I raised my hand. I'm the only one who looks like me in the class. And I raise my hand and I say to her, Professor Hughes, are we going to have some material on black women? And she said, oh, yes, you're right. We need to have some material on black women. Why don't you go out and find us something?
Wow.
Which, in the days when I went to graduate school, that was one of your jobs as a graduate student. Graduate students were there to help the professors get their research done and help to educate them. So, it sounds exploitative, but that was the deal. And I was like, yes, okay. And remember I had gotten my driver's license, and so I had bought a little Volkswagen Bug, and my little 1968 Volkswagen Bug, which I totaled on the way home from Montreal, so I had to replace it quick because I was still teaching and I had to be able to get to Burlington. So I bought a 1964 Volkswagen Bug, and it was a little battered gray bug, and I named that one Beowulf. The one that I totaled was named Ronnie. This one was named Beowulf, and it looked like a Beowulf. So I got in Beowulf and drove to all these great research libraries in the greater Boston area, because you've got Brandeis, you've got everybody there. But I did what a lot of people don't do when they go to the library. Go to the librarian first. I didn't do that.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
I did not do that. And I'm trying to find stuff on black women. And I go home empty-handed. So sad. And I lay down. And just as I'm drifting off to sleep, a little voice says, you've only been black since 1965. Go back and look under Negro and colored. Got up the next day, got in Beowulf, drove around, came into class the next week with a stack this high.
Wow.
And a chunk of it was by way of W.E.B. Du Bois, who, if you don't know W.E.B. Du Bois, here's another one of my little Oxbow sidecars. You need to know him. Born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, he wrote for in 1868, died in 1963 in Ghana, Accra, Ghana, the night before the March on Washington. Oh, does it give you goosebumps?
Wow.
Andrew Young's Godly Coincidences, okay. And he wrote for publication from the time he was 15 years old. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin was one of his early editors. He was the correspondent from Great Barrington for one of the newspapers she owned. Oh, so wow. Yeah, I mean, there's all these connections. Gosh. So I've got all of this stuff, and a lot of it was his arguments for votes for women. He was a militant suffragist. He wanted votes for women. And he used the magazine, The Crisis, he was the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard University. He gets the PhD, and then he goes to Wilberforce, proposes a sociology course. His PhD is not in sociology because sociology was just getting started as a discipline. And so he proposed a sociology course, and they said no at Wilberforce. And because they said no, Colby College got to be the first place that had a sociology course. All of that is to say that he was the militant suffragist Went from Wilberforce, did the Philadelphia Negro study for the University of Pennsylvania, and then went to Atlanta University. And he had conferences and brought in men and women to talk about the issues facing African Americans. So here I have this stack of stuff. And in a way, that was the starting point for me, discovering all of this material, discovering that African American women were left out and that the presumptions about African American women were molded in the realities of white women, which weren't the same. Furthermore, and this adds to my work as a sociologist, one of the things that happened to my discipline is the McCarthy era. If anybody ever takes an introductory sociology course, you will often get the lecture that says the founding fathers, and they always say fathers, of the discipline are Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And the most you learn about Marx is basically, you get the Communist Manifesto because he talks about the history of humankind being the emergence of classes and I can't even recite it. Okay, but that's it. But the trouble with the discipline is that most of the theorizing is in response to Marx. So they ignore Marx because the McCarthy era really put a stamp on not talking about Marx. If you're watching what's going on right now, we've passed this way before. And I remember asking one of my professors, I said, what did you do during the McCarthy era? Because he was actually a Marxist scholar. He said, I put my mouth in my head pocket and I kept it shut. But the methodology for Marx, and this is, he was a thick description historian, a historical sociologist. That's, if you want to know why is Marx important, for me, that's why he's important. When I do a lecture on class with my students, and I would try to be, Marx, Weber comes along and says, okay, Marx, you're right about this, class being this economic thing, but we also have to take into account status, prestige levels, and we have to take into account political alignment. So he writes this big major essay, Class, Status, and Party. And so when I talk to my students, I would put class on the board and I'd go CLA, $, so they would understand the difference between class and status. And then we could talk about people who may have jobs that pay them almost no money, but they have much prestige. People admire them. School teachers are a very good example of that. If they got paid for the prestige that they have, they would, basically own the Rockefeller Foundation. But it doesn't work that way. So we get to those dilemmas and contradictions in class and status. So all of this got me started in looking at African American women. And then when I told my professors that I was going to do my dissertation on Black women community leaders because I was interested in history. Okay, this is the other piece. Another sociologist by the name of William Julius Wilson was busy bringing history back in to the analysis of sociology, especially with reference to race relations. Remember, I've been teaching this course for 39 weeks. From the time I started teaching in 1973 until I retired from my day job in 2022, I never taught a race relations course without assigning at least one of William Julius Wilson's books. That's how important it was for my thinking. And he wrote this wonderful book called Power, Racism, and Privilege. Sociologists didn't discover the concept of racism, and we're talking about race relations, but we're not talking about racism until after the Black Power movement. So you have to talk about the impact of social movements on intellectual thinking, on conceptual revolutions, et cetera. So all of this is happening, and women are very much involved in all of this. And I'm gathering all of this stuff up, trying to make sense of various particular points of social change and how people reorganize in response to major social change. So I'm looking at change agents. I want to know about change agents. I want to know about why are all of these women admired. That was the other thing, that while people are talking about, anyway, I start going out, and my professors, when I say I'm going to do this, Everett Hughes's understanding of the moral division of labor among groups, culture, etc., they said to me, and this is the discipline that I was a part of, they said to me, well, there's no such thing as black culture.
Oh my gosh.
Well, listen, I mean, and so I'm like, okay, how am I going to do this? And the nice thing about Everett Hughes is that he's the founder of an area of sociology called symbolic interaction. And it was a way that sociologists had of talking about culture rather than just leaving it to the anthropologists. So this is how, but it's situational culture, not, whole society. But that was the way I wiggled my way in. My dissertation advisor was a disciple of Hughes, who, by the way, I also worked with his wife on the newsletter for Sociologists for Women in Society. So we'd go to our house on Saturdays and edit the newsletter. And she accused me. She said, you just come here to help me so you can come and sit at my husband's feet and talk to him. And I said, I come to help you because I want to help you. And I want to sit at his feet. Because he had been with Du Bois in the year that they went to Canada to celebrate the centennial of British emancipation, and he was worried that those of us who look like Angela Davis's short, fat, evil twin would not understand this older generation of sociologists, and that, no, they were not Uncle Toms. You have to understand what they did to survive. So this is what I'm doing in graduate school while I'm working on this and gathering up all of this material on women and figuring out how I'm going to talk about black culture without talking about black culture in order to get this study done. So I figured it out, and I'm going out to find people, women who are the standard for my study. They have to be admired for what they had done to change things in the black community for a long time. They had to be mentioned in the black press 8 years prior to my coming to see them, because I didn't want people who had just gotten involved with one little project and gone away. I wanted people who had been in it for a long time. And so literally, that was how I did it, because I was also, William Julius Wilson, bringing history back in, trying to find out how things changed. I had to go back and ask questions about slavery and women in slavery. Okay, one other thing. All of this is happening. This is an exciting time to be in graduate school and have to deal with these folks who say, there's no black culture. Okay. It's exciting, but it also tells you how fraught and how problematic just getting new learning in. Until a man by the name of John Blassingame published a book titled The Slave Community, there was no study of slavery in the United States from the point of view of the people who were enslaved. If it was the Southern school of historians, slavery was this institution that took these poor, benighted, primitive, know-nothing, empty-headed people and gave them skills, etc. You hearing something? Okay. That was the Southern school. And as one, Ulrich Bonnell Phillips said, the only problem is that, it's not any different from the settlement houses, thinking of Hull House, etc., except there's no opportunity for graduation. He's making Southern slavery sound like Jane Addams with whips and chains. So that was the Southern school. The Northern school was slavery was an evil, terrible thing, and it destroyed those people. Both sides are saying neither, black people cannot be fully human. I mean, this is part of the problem. And so along comes Blassingame, who says, we're going to look at slavery from the point of view of the people who were enslaved. He's also answering the misuse and abuse of the scholarship on slavery by the Moynihan Report. Here we are back at the Moynihan Report again. I mean, and a man by the name of Stanley Elkins and his approach. So all of this is going on. So the sociologists are trying to figure out what's going on in slavery. You know, is it a total institution? Is it what Irving Goffman says? Is it what Stanley Elkins says? And along comes Blasingame and says, we're going to see what the people who were enslaved say. Right. And that started a whole new approach. John Blasingame, Albert Rabbitoe, Slave Religion, Deborah Gray White, Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Antebellum South. And and there's many more. Darlene Clark Hine, in her book, I highly recommend it, Shining Thread of Hope. Shining Thread of Hope. I can't recommend it more highly because it begins to help us look at the cultural capital that people who were deported from Africa to be enslaved in the New World brought with them and how they used it. And this is particularly true for women. I did not know until I read Darlene Clark Hine's book, Shining Thread of Hope. And by this time, the book got published after I was already on tenure track. I forget what year it came in. But anyway, somebody will Google it and tell me what year. This is one of the fun things about the 21st century now. So here we have, because the various African ethnic groups, and when we're talking about the United States, and I'm being very United States specific now because let me just be United States specific without explaining why. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall and others, Skip Gates and others, point to the predominance of about 45 ethnic groups out of a continent of over 1,000. So, you know, and part of the importance of the folks who came between 1619 and 1808 is they were drawn from the Senegambia, which is the rice-growing area. And rice was the product, and they needed people who had the skills to grow it. And in order to get people from rice-growing areas, they had to bring in both men and women. Okay. Those African women came in, and they had to pass a law in the 17th century in Charleston, South Carolina, prohibiting black women from establishing markets and trading in the foodstuffs that they were bringing into town because, you know, the slave owners weren't going to go into town and sell their own stuff. They sent their folks in, you know, figuring these are the poor benighted folks. They don't know what they're doing. Let's just, you know. And these women are setting up trading situations. They had taken over the food supply of Charleston, South Carolina. That is the kind of cultural capital that folks brought in. And these are the women. And Deborah Gray White points out that because of the nature of slavery, women spent more time with each other than they did with men. And which was also true very often in the African context. So it was gendered, but in the African context, similar to some of the Native American contexts, women had power and voices and were organized to make those voices heard. And so that is some of the cultural capital that African women bring with them. And she points out that these women organized prayer bands. This is all within the slave community. This is the unsupervised slave worship. When you think about slavery in the United States, everybody says they passed laws that prevented them from reading and writing. They passed laws that prevented them from unsupervised slave worship. Keep in mind that nations do not pass laws against behavior that does not exist. You don't pass laws against people learning how to read and write until you find out, oh my God, not only did they learn how to read and write, they know that we're lying about the Bible by not telling them about Moses. Okay, and 10% of the folks who arrived here, at least 10% of the folks who arrived here in North America knew who Musa was. Musa is the name for Moses in the Quran. Okay.
Yeah.
They also know who Jesus was and Mary was. I mean, Mary has 2 whole stories to herself in the Quran, and the spirituals tradition celebrates women in a way that the English hymn tradition does not. So we're just getting to freedom. You've already got women organized within the slave community, but free women are also organizing. And so you've got missionaries, you've got the Anti-Slavery Society that you've been studying.
Right.
And between churches, Sunday schools, etc., women are getting organized. Another oxbow. I'm at the Eastern Sociological Society meetings one year. Remember, I'm still having this problem as a graduate student. There's no such thing as black culture. Why do you want to study these women? You're just studying the, how did one of my professors put it? He says, oh, you're just studying the black women who are like the, what's that? I'm blanking on it right now, but basically, you know, he was treating it like an upper class women's club. And I'm like, this is not how we're doing it. So I'm constantly struggling with this. But, and I just lost my train of thought. I was telling you about, doing this little oxbow about, I'm at the Eastern Sociological Society, and author of The Feminine Mystique. No, that's Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan comes to speak. And so she's standing up there speaking, and I'm still in Angela Davis short, fat, evil twin mode. So I'm sitting there in a T-shirt, a work shirt, and jeans in the back of the room, you know, one of the 2 or 3 black faces in this huge room full of white women. And she gets up and she says, and people keep saying to me, how are we going to organize black women? Let me tell you something. Black women have been organized for years. They don't need to be organized. We need to be asking them questions. And I'm sitting in the back of the room going, at least Betty Friedan understands. And then a couple of the women who knew me turned around and said, ooh, can you tell us something about that? And I'm like, let me get my dissertation done first. And I just sort of and went on out the room. But I was so relieved when Betty Friedan said that, because I was studying something that was real, and I was trying to figure out how this generation of women went from slavery through Reconstruction to urban migration, following William Julius Wilson's outline, to the current issues at the time in the 1970s in the 1970s, when we're slightly post-civil rights, trying to organize communities, trying to deal with issues of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of that is to answer your question of how I got interested in it. I was, and one other, I got to tell you one other story.
I know.
Now, I tell you 2 other stories. Okay.
All right, we're on a roll.
I finally started applying for tenure-track jobs, and I've been teaching at Northeastern. I taught at Tufts. I taught at Boston State. I taught at UMass. One year, I was teaching on Mondays. I taught a course that there was no alternative section for the police officers to transfer to. It was a required course for their program. So I walk in. Short, fat, evil twin mode, okay? And I've got this room. I've got 45 students. I have 40 white male police officers, 4 civilians, one of whom was black, and 1 female police officer, white female police officer, who sat in the back with the 4 civilians, never wore her uniform, never told the rest of the class that she was also a police officer. And so it was me, 40 white dudes. I learned all the ways you could carry a gun. I mean, it was under the hip, in the back, on the ankle. And I could have committed a Class A felony in the room and would not have been arrested, because some of the men would have had to explain why they were out of their sector while they were on duty in my classroom. Fortunately, I did not do that. But I had these 40 dudes and these 5 people in the back. That was on Monday. on Thursday, I was teaching for UMass out at the maximum security prison at Walpole.
Whoa, whoa.
And so I had, men on one side, I had black men on one side and white men on the other. And this is the way God works. One of my students, because I never asked them what they did. I knew I was in maximum security prison, but I didn't, it was just me, and it was about 30 guys, and I'm teaching intro Soc. I learned that with certain things in prison you had to be sensitive about. There's a standard lecture that you give in an intro Soc course when you talk about Durkheim. Remember Max Weber Durkheim? Okay. Durkheim did this empirical research studying suicide. That's a standard. I had a student who actually dissociated in class. Fortunately, I was really into R.D. Laing at that moment. Remember, my first car was named Ronnie? That was after R.D. Laing, the psychiatrist. So I'm busy listening intently to the content of his dissociation till I was finally able to talk to him about it and brought him back, and we got all settled and resettled in class. Afterwards, one of the students came up to me. He said, "You really handled that well. You don't know." Because they knew that he was having problems, but his fellow prisoners had been helping to support him and protect him. And they do things like that in prison. Okay. And then he said, "You handled that really well, but you have to understand, when you give a lecture on suicide, every single one of us in this room has considered committing suicide." And I'm like, wow. So I was in total learning mode. So that was that year. I still had Beowulf. Okay. But it turned out the person who said you handled that well turned out to be the boyfriend of the female police officer that I was teaching on Monday.
Oh my God.
Long story, I won't go into it. But anyway, we made it through the year. And, at one point in the class, every time I would assign something that made these officers, these 40 dudes, feel like I was invading their space, et cetera, they would sort of riot in class. And one day, one of the officers in class turned around and said to them, "Fellas, he used the S word. She knows what's going on." After that, I didn't have any problems. And the civilians told me, "You're lucky. They like you." I said, "What do they do to people they don't like?" And she told me, and I'm like, oh my God. But it helps if you treat people like human beings and don't make presumptions and stereotype them, and which was what the other faculty members were doing, which was why they were busy negotiating. If we sit in the back and stay silent, will you give us a C? So they were able to look past the short, fat, evil twin aspect, and actually we did a lot. And I learned a lot about policing. I learned a lot about policing. But I get to my first tenure track job. They invite me back with my dissertation advisor and myself to talk to the rest of the graduate program about the process, because I was only the second PhD they had gotten out the door, so they wanted to encourage more. And so I'd gotten out the door, and I'd gotten a job at a different level because affirmative action required that you advertise jobs. So I was able to apply for a job I never would have gotten had affirmative action not happened. Okay, this is just the application process made a difference in the. So we're coming back to talk about the process of doing the dissertation, her version and my version. Fortunately, they let her go first. And she's sitting there in front of this group. She said, "Well, when Cheryl came to me with this idea that she had for studying these women, I was totally opposed to it." And I'm like, "Really?" Oh. And every week I would raise objections. And every week she would come back and answer my objections. One week she raised objections that were so traumatic for me that my friends had to send across campus, get 2 Valium and pour me into a car and send me home. Okay, but I came back the next week and I brought her pastry every week. I would stop at the best French pastry shop in Harvard Square and get a little box of pastry and show up, and we would sit and have our weekly meetings. And so she said, and every week and she would just come back. I decided to let her go into the field. And when she failed, she would come back and do what I wanted. And she said, lo and behold, she came back with the data. And so that was like, and I'm going, okay, I wasn't crazy. You know, I wasn't crazy. And so I got it done. So I get this first job, and they give me an advisor. You know, a senior faculty member who has gotten tenure and he's made a name, gotten the national reputation, he's published, done all the things they want me to make sure I do. So he comes to my office one day, we're having a session, he reaches over, grabs my knee like I'm one of the fellas. He said, now that you're here, you're going to stop doing all that black stuff and do some regular sociology. And I reached over, grabbed his knee like he's one of the fellas. I became a sociologist so I could get this black stuff into the discipline. And that's what I've been doing. So now if you take an introductory course in sociology, the standard lecture is the founding fathers of the discipline are Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and Du Bois.
All right.
Sometimes they will talk about the founding mothers, and they will include Ida B. Wells Barnett and Anna Julia Cooper. But it takes a while. We're talking about 50 years of intellectual struggle in just one discipline. In just one discipline. My friend Alden Morris has published a book titled on Du Bois about the excluded, about the Du Bois being an excluded scholar. And that just came out. And Oxford University just published a handbook on Du Bois. And I'm not saying this to brag, but I have a chapter in it on Du Bois and women, and Du Bois and gender. And just translating his work to bring it back into the discipline when all of these things have been going on is major work. But by the standards about which we care in terms of women and women's rights, Du Bois argued that there were three great revolutions at work, because he's a sociologist trying to talk about a big vision of society, and it is race, it is labor, and it is women, and that black women represent all three. Yes. All three. And that was central to his thinking and the work that he did. So that's, in answer to your question, that's how I got into it. And of course, I have stayed there. And then when I went to study African American, I got into religious studies because I was still trying to answer this question. And this is what happens when people get PhDs, because they have a question that they like that's going to keep them in the library for the rest of their lives. Yeah. Okay, if you that's really, we're not that useful otherwise. We could, if you want somebody who's good about going to the library and reading, or about going to the Barnes and Noble and being well known to the salespeople because they realize you have a book addiction and they are your pushers. Yeah. But we're not always that helpful. And as you can see, sometimes we college professors, we can analyze stuff to death, but to actually figure out a strategy to do something, to make a change, we got to work at that. So that's how I became interested, and learning about the club movement. Yes. And its centrality. And Du Bois agrees with me about the club movement and its centrality. So I was trying to answer still William Julius Wilson's questions, and I started asking questions about something called the sanctified church, which is the African American term for a family of churches, congregations, and denominations that are holiness, Pentecostal, deliverance, apostolic. And in the process, because these are all churches that have emerged at the end of Reconstruction. Okay, and with social change, when people are making new organizations, you need to understand what's generating the need for the new organizations. So right. I walk into the headquarters of one of the churches on study, and you're from Memphis, you know exactly what I'm talking about, Church of God in Christ. Yes. I walk into their headquarters, and this is a church that does not believe in ordaining women. Their book of discipline said, we do not recognize, and they give you a list of scriptures, So if you ever need a list of scriptures arguing for the ordination of women, it's all right there in the handbook. We do not recognize these scriptures as a mandate to ordain a woman to be elder, pastor, or bishop. However, a woman may teach the gospel to others and have charge of the church in the absence of the pastor. So if they have an evangelist and the pastor dies, well, he's absent, we can call her now, okay? Yeah, that happens. But I walk into their headquarters, and here I am. I've got a grant from Harvard Divinity School. You go to Harvard Divinity School, and there's a wall full of white males, right? All portraits. I walk into this church that ostensibly does not ordain women, and there's a wall full of women. And that says something. I need to ask questions about that and start looking at that research. And you get to see the networks of organized women across religious boundaries, across political boundaries, and even when I didn't start out to study women in the church. I was just studying organization and social change, but I end up, women are the first thing I see, and again, how central they are, and the inability for people to see it when they're not looking for women in terms of the cultural capital that they bring, in terms of how they have built organizations, what they do, and how women in working for the whole community. Alice Walker's book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, has this wonderful definition of something called womanist on the first 2 pages. And one of the things is working for the entire community, women and men. And that's what these women did. Even when slavery ended and folks are trying to become part of the political system, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, another little sidecar. The attack on the 14th Amendment is not just an attack on quote unquote birthright citizenship. That's a nickname for just the first clause of the amendment. The important part of the 14th Amendment, and we cannot allow it to be taken, any kind of constitutional convention or anything to take it away. The important part of the 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause, because Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the same year that the National Association of Colored Women, which becomes the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the same year that the 2 organizations that merge to create that, is also the same year as Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson is a states' rights Supreme Court decision. It says the states have the right to require segregation as long as the facilities are equal. And from 1896 to 1954, the constant push was stare decisis. There was one case after another case after another case after another case. In, I think it was, whether, I can't remember if it was Kentucky or West Virginia. There was one college that was educating both black and white students, and they were told that if they were going to educate both black and white students, they had to separate them by 20 miles. And the college went into court to fight it. The Supreme Court said stare decisis, but they gave the college relief on the 20 miles. So this is from 1896 on into the 20th century. And the constant chipping away that was done by the NAACP was, these facilities are not equal. These facilities are not equal. Texas tried to start a whole new law school. They wanted a separate and equal law school. That's how committed to segregation these people were. And a woman by the name of Pauli Murray, who worked for the Methodist Church, Methodist Episcopal Church North, because Methodist Church hasn't been united until the 1960s. But in the 1950s, the Methodist Episcopal Church North, the women of that church decided they wanted to fight segregation. But in order to fight segregation, they had to know what it was. So they hired Pauli Murray, who was a lawyer by this time, but who had gone to Howard University Law School, had been part of a team of students that were trained by Charles Hamilton Houston, and then after he died, by Spotswood Robinson. She was a student with Thurgood Marshall. They were all together, and she had written a paper that said you need to make a frontal assault on segregation based on equal protection. Okay. Her student paper is part of the briefs. That was the Brown case. She helped overturn Brown. He didn't find out that she had helped overturn Brown until long after Brown had been overturned. But she put together a volume for the Methodist Church titled States' Laws on Race and Color. I mean, it is this thick, state by state. Wow. And in order to find out what the state laws were. And it was a states' rights argument all the way through until Brown. And it is an equal protection argument. And because of that equal protection argument, and I didn't even know this, as much as I've taught all these courses, I used Richard Kluger's Simple Justice. It's about this thick, like a phone book. I had a class where we just read, the only thing we did was read that book line by line. I highly recommend it if you want to look at that legal history. But why equal protection matters so much. I'm watching Oprah Winfrey, getting good data from Oprah Winfrey, one day, and she has a young man who is white on, and he is blind. And he's done all this great stuff, which was why he was on the show. You know, when she has people on the show, they've done amazing stuff that, makes us want to watch the show. And she said, to what do you attribute all of your achievements? And he said, Brown versus Board of Education. And I'm like, wow. Oh my God. Huh. Not only did they have to desegregate the schools for black and white children, but they had to provide services for all children. Special needs, all that legislation that followed, the Department of Education. Yes, this is what this is about. Be prepared to participate in defending the 14th Amendment. So getting back 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments make it possible for black people to enter the political system. And of course, women can't vote because the 15th Amendment basically says that men can vote. What did black women do in the South? They provided security, armed security for the men's meetings for voting. When the terrorists start to try to push them out of the political system, women insist that men must vote. Keep in mind, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, they want voting rights, and they also want voting rights for women, but they know that voting rights for men matters for the whole community. And this is how it works out. This is really an important component of it. That equal protection piece of the 14th Amendment is also critical for every child who has a reading difficulty and gets some kind of support for that, for every child who has a wheelchair accessible way of getting into school. All of that is tied deeply to this root and to this struggle. And the education piece was critical. Now, does that answer your question about how I got interested?
It answered everything.
Oh dear.
No.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Well, I'm just curious now because I know that, to get back to Josephine.
Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. Okay, let's get back to Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin.
How she starts to work to, or helping to organize.
Well, the thing is,
women are already organized, but working
this
with
is
it.
this is the thing you need to understand about
Yes.
Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. There's club movements. There's a white club movement. There's a black club movement.
Right.
By the time that and the club movements were such that you had, among black women, you had a group called the Colored Women's League, or the League of Colored Women. And their principal organizer, prominent organizer, is Mary Church Terrell, who is
Right.
from Memphis.
Yeah.
And you also have the National Federation of Afro-American Women, whose principal organizer and head is Margaret Murray Washington. Bing, bing, bing. She's Booker T. Washington's wife. And you've got clubs that are being organized throughout communities. Why are women organizing clubs? They're organizing clubs to educate their children. They're organizing clubs to raise money. They're organizing mothers' clubs. What are mothers' clubs doing? Well, you have a club of women who are mothers, and whenever somebody is pregnant, she has her baby, because it's only been recently that we've been having babies in the hospital. And so, all of my aunts were born at home. And I know exactly what address in Germantown. You think of all the people you know in your previous generations. They were born in hospitals. Well, what would this group of women do? The club would show up at your house and clean house and cook food and help care for your other children while you're lying in. Mm-hmm. And as one woman told me, when the children grew, then we had to raise scholarship money. And so that's how our clubs grew. So these were functional organizations of women. They are fraternal order, they are auxiliaries to fraternal orders. Why the big deal with fraternal orders? They're burial societies. They're raising money to bury people. Hello? And if we're going to bury people in a society that doesn't think we're human, we're going to do a superhuman job of burying them. If you've ever seen the movie Imitation of Life, both versions of Imitation of Life, at the end of the movie, there is this beautiful processional out, and in the first one, you see the Knights Templar, you see Prince Hall Knights Templar. They went and got a real lodge to do that one, and they're bringing this woman out of the church. But the insurance payments that she's paid to them is paying for all of this great stuff that's happening. So burial societies, again, anything that human beings do and have a need, people organize to do, and these women's clubs are organizing. Sometimes it was temperance. They would organize temperance units. But then they have another need. We've got to deal with these young girls who need a special home. Well, our club can't do it because we've got all these friends who can't take the pledge. So we've got to form another group so that they can join as well. So you also have overlapping memberships and everything. The women's missionary societies. And after 1901, you have something in black churches called Women's Day. So they have women's organizations and they visit one another. One of the leaders is a woman by the name of Nannie Helen Burroughs. Nannie Helen Burroughs, who starts out as the corresponding secretary for the National Baptist Convention, who introduces Women's Day. They form the Women's Auxiliary of the National Baptist Convention. And every church should have a day when women are doing the speaking. And if women are shy, Nannie Helen Burroughs said, don't worry, my national office will send you speeches to read, so you won't have to write your own. I mean, this is how they did it, very practical. And then she said, the majority of black women, no matter how educated they are, will have to work as household domestics. So she starts a training school in Washington, D.C., sort of under the Washington method, the Du Bois-Washington debate over types of education, industrial. But she starts this school, but she's also a friend with Carter Woodson, and she works with Carter Woodson in the formation of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History that has given us Negro History Week that has become Black History Month. That's where it came from. And in her school, not only must you know your Bible solidly, not only must you be as skilled as possible so you're up on the best techniques and the best technology for caring for people's homes so you will be competitive for these jobs in these cities, because women are moving to the cities first because they're trying to get away from all of the horror of the rural areas where they're subject to rape if they're household domestics, etc. But you also, to pass the graduation requirement, must be able to give a public oration on Negro history. Her vision was an army of articulate women who could stand anywhere and bear witness to the African American experience. So you see, in a way, that this class thing obscures what's actually going on among African American women, because since they're working class, you may be what we call working class women, but they're working class women who make the dresses for their employers, and so they dress well too.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ann Lowe. If you don't know the name Ann Lowe, go
Yes.
study her life,
Yes.
and
Yes.
you'll find that
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Karen Fields, her book Lemon Swamp and Other Places, which is an oral history with her grandmother, who Charleston, South Carolina, the Sea Islands, but she also talks about what they did and how, we're talking about the Black elite, but that Black elite were the working class, what we would consider the working class jobs, and she gives example. She was a school teacher who made a little tiny bit of money per month. Her husband was a house builder. He was the source of the big income. So, which is the working class job and which is the elite job.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
So this is where you have to sort of be careful about that. But she's a northerner. She's part of this northern group. The women, the white club movement in Massachusetts did not exclude Black women the way the rest of the suffragists did. And they were trying to make sure that Black women were kept out so that they could convince the Southern senators, the segregationists, to vote for women's suffrage.
Right.
So this was, and so the whole politics of race and racial domination is very much a part of this process, and the battle against both, against all of that, is part of what's going on. That generation, the Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin generation. Now, what Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin does, it's very important, she calls this national convention in Boston, and women from all these groups come together. And eventually, and this is what happens, her national convention, I think, is 1892, and by 1896, both the Colored Women's League and the Federation of Afro-American Women, again, women belonged to clubs that were in both groups. So if you went to the National Convention for one, you might go to the National Convention for the other. And that year, both national conventions were held in Washington, D.C. One was at the Presbyterian Church, the other one was at a Baptist church. And groups of women ran into each other on the street in between the two conventions, and they said, "This is ridiculous, we need to come together." And that's how the National Association of Colored Women, which will become the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, gets together. And then they hammer out, each group has a committee of 7 that gets together, and they hammer out a constitution. And Mary Church Terrell makes it clear. Mary Church Terrell was so admired, so highly admired, she said she could have been president for life, which is why they built the 4-year tenure into the Constitution, because she didn't want to be president for life. So that's, understand.
That's good.
But Mrs. Ruffin was also, in addition to the newsletter, The Women's Era,
Right.
she also had owned a newspaper, as I mentioned earlier, to which W.E.B. Du Bois was the correspondent from Great Barrington and started his writing for publication at the age of 15. And
Right.
he wrote until he died at the age of 95. And when I give presentations on Du Bois, I have a hardcover annotated bibliography of Du Bois's published works, just his published works. We're not talking about the unpublished stuff, the stuff that's in his papers. The annotated bibliography weighs 5 pounds.
Wow. Wow.
If it was a baby, it could go home from the hospital.
Well, I know we're running out of time, so I don't know if there's anyone who has any specific questions to ask Dr. Gilkes.
Remember, as I've told my students since 1973, I said this in the very first class in Burlington, and I'm still saying it. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Now, do we have any questions?
I think you covered a lot.
Okay.
I think you covered all kinds of wonderful. This was
Now, I do have one question. Are you thinking now to write another book, mostly focusing on Josephine, or are you?
Oh,
just
no. I've got several book projects in place. In fact,
Okay.
I just did. I did two-hour workshops yesterday on a book that I'm working on. It's called That Blessed Book: The Bible and the African American Cultural Imagination, and it looks at African American orature with a heavy emphasis on the spirituals and asks the question, why did these folks flag these specific texts for us, and how do we explore it? And it answered. So that's one of my book projects. I've been writing sociologists talk to each other in articles and papers, which is, and when you get enough of them together, you put it in a book. One of the chapters in the book is going to be on the role of women in the spirituals, because it is clear that the English hymn tradition does not have a central place for women, but the spirituals do. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Oh, Martha, don't you moan. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Run, Mary, run. Run, Mary, run. You got a right to the tree of life. Okay. That's just 2 examples. Okay. So that's one of my projects. And they're in different stages. I've got one, I've published an article from it, and it's still in its infancy. It's called With My Face to the Rising Sun, and it looks at the role of Muslims in shaping African American Christianity during slavery. 10 to 18% of the Africans who were landed alive in what is now, in British North America and what is now the United States, were Muslim. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I'm working with the 10%, 10% is a nice conservative, that's the lowest. What difference does it make 1 in 10? Just think of being in a group of 10 people where one of you has access to the New Yorker and you let the rest of the other 9 know what's going on. Okay, that helps
sharing.
you. Yeah. So those are my principal
That's why she's
book
so busy.
projects. Plus, I've never published my dissertation. When I was graduated in '79. People still weren't interested in black women, and so the publisher's response was, well, this 400 and some odd pages will make a nice paper.
Wow.
But I have gotten articles and chapters in books out of it, about 8 of them, so it's not like it's just sat there and didn't do anything, but one day I may actually get that published as well. But so I've got several things I'm working on. But women
Sounds
show
like
up
it.
in all of that. 2 of the major chapters in the Du Bois book are going to be on Du Bois and women. And so,
Great.
Thank you
you're welcome.
so much, and thank you, Sheila,
You're welcome.
as well. I'm just so appreciative of this time and of all of that you've shared with us.
Well, thank
And,
you.
Yeah.
can
I
we-
have fun coming to talk to you, and I get to see my dear friend, Michelle Phillips.
So,
Very good.
thank you.
you. Oh, one other thing. I brought this to remind me to tell you. There's this wonderful author named Imani Perry. Imani Perry. But she wrote a book, May We Forever Stand. It's the history of the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing Till Earth and Heaven Ring. And she has a section in here that talks about how it is the women's clubs and the women's club movement and the publications of the various clubs that spread this song around throughout the Black community. So that's just, so I brought that to remember to tell you that, in case you didn't ask me a question that gave me an opportunity to tell you.
Well, once again, thank you so much. We are
You're
so
welcome.
very grateful. Thank you.